Good morning, everyone. Um, Welcome to Professor Patel-Grosz lecture at the Updating ao Vivo Linguistics Online. I hope that all of you attending the event today are healthy and safe. I'm Vitor Nóbrega. I'm a linguist and currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Laboratory for Human Evolutionary Studies at the Biosciences Institute, University of São Paulo. Let me begin by thanking Abralim, especially Abralim's president, Professor Miguel Oliveira Jr., and its vice president, Professor Raquel Freitag, for organizing this event. And a special thanks for Professor Selene Rodrigues, who mediated the invitation. And on behalf of Abralim and of my fellow linguists in Brazil, I would like to immensely thank Professor Patel-Grosz for kindly accepting the invitation to collaborate with this project. It's an enormous pleasure to have you here with us today. Updating ao Vivo Linguistics Online is an international initiative in cooperation with the Comité Internacional Permanent de Linguistes, the Associación de Linguística y Filología de América Latina, a Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, Associação de Linguística Aplicada do Brasil, Associação Internacional de Linguistique Appliquée, Linguistic Society of America, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, Sociedades Linguística Europeia, Australian Linguistic Society, British Association for Applied Linguistics, and the Sociedade Española de Linguística. Pritty Patel-Grosz is Professor of General Linguistics at the Department of Linguistics and Scandinavian Studies at the University of Oslo. She received her PhD from MIT in 2012 and her habilitation in 2015 from the University of Tübingen. She's the director of Superlinguistics Research Group. She has constantly participated in national and international congresses and has been invited to give lectures by several international universities and research centers. Her main research interests include context-dependent variables at the syntax-semantics pragmatics interface, information structure, dance semantics, music semantics, syntax semantics of gestures, and primate linguistics. Now I invite you to enjoy Professor Patel-Grosz's lecture on dance semantics and extensions to music. After her lecture, we'll have up to 20 minutes of questions and discussion. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Here we go. So I'd like to start by thanking Abralim and Vivo for this very, very kind invitation and for all their work and service to the field and beyond. So thank you for uniting the global linguistics community during these challenging times and for providing a platform that makes linguistic research so freely available and accessible to everybody. I'll be presenting the findings of joint research conducted together with music tech researchers Alexander Refsum-Jensenius and Tejaswini Kelkar, linguist Pritty Patel-Grosz, and linguist and professional musician Jonah Katz. So superlinguistic approaches to dance were pioneered recently, initially by linguist Donna Jo Napoli and professional dancer and dance educator Lisa Krauss. And they ask whether there are parameters of dance similar to the parameters that have originally been posited for linguistics in the principles and parameters tradition. And Napoli and Krauss start with this quote on the slide, focusing on the fact that both dance and language are produced by the body and governed by cognitive faculties. And in line with the general superlinguistic spirit, they propose that applying linguistic methods grounded in biology to the study of dance might be insightful. Now, they make one thing clear very quickly, which is that culture often plays a role in dance. And this might in fact be the first thing you think about when you hear dance. But from a superlinguistics perspective, so the idea of applying linguistic methodology and methodology inspired by linguistics to objects that go beyond language, it's really important to focus on those aspects of dance that are purely physical and non-cultural. So, for example, if we were investigating ballet, the only thing that would matter is the physicality of the movement and not the Western classical culture that would accompany it. More recently, Isabelle Charneval has argued that dance has a syntax along the lines of music as posited by Lerdahl and Jackendorf, and also language. And the core notion here is the notion of grouping. So this is the idea that dance sequences can be segmented into smaller sequences or so-called groups. So if you look at the ballet sequence that's diagrammed on this slide, this sequence is called a glissade. And there is one part that repeats 4 times. And we can say that each repetition is one group. So I've boxed the groups just in order to emphasize the repetition. And Charneval proposes that every dance can be exhaustively partitioned into groups of this sort. And she marks this with the lines underneath the dance postures. And the horizontal lines mark the time axis, and the vertical lines indicate the grouping boundaries. Now, you'll notice that there are also intermediate level groupings. So 2 repetitions are grouped together twice, and what we have derived is essentially hierarchical structure, very much of the kind that we find in the syntax of music, but also the syntax of language. So to test whether dance has a semantics, we singled out a phenomena that we could investigate by means of a production study. So just to be clear about the type of semantics we're looking for, I want to zoom in on 2 examples. So the co-reference case is given in 1A. A man came into the room, and then that man, closed the window. And so here, we have an existential quantifier which introduces a single individual. The disjoint reference case is given in 2A. A man came into the room and another man closed the window. So here, there's no identity relationship between these 2 individuals. So unlike the co-reference case where there's a single individual, in the disjoint reference case, there are 2 individuals. And what we're interested in is the denotation of natural language expressions, such as these examples like in 1A, and how they are compositionally derived from their parts. So when we're investigating dance, we're aiming to look for any phenomena that may have similar properties. So we started by looking at Bharatanatyam. Bharatanatyam is a 2,000-year-old figurative dance that serves to tell a story. And as a type of dance, Bharatanatyam can be compared to pantomime, and we expect it to share certain properties of silent visual narratives, and these are previously investigated by Dorita Bush. I want to play you a clip so that you can see what this dance form looks like. And this dance sequence is from the Kala Sadhana Dance Institute here in Oslo. So we used motion capture recordings in our study. So on the bottom, you see our dancer, she's been recorded, and she's wearing 45 motion capture tracking dots. And these are recorded from 8 different angles. And the QTM software generates a 3-dimensional rendering, which is what you see on the top there. And these animations are very, very useful for perception studies. And I'm going to present one a little bit later on. So we're going to use these 3-dimensional renderings in order to zoom in on the parts of the dance sequence that are going to be relevant for us. So we're keeping things super simple and easy. The formal linguistic methodology we're adopting here is minimal pairs. And we asked our dancer to perform a set of items that probe for this co-reference versus disjoint reference distinction. And the context is one where an artist has designed a statue for a temple. And one very helpful aspect of this context is that there are many people in the temple. And what this does for us is that it allows us to freely introduce discourse reference. So this is the 3D rendering of item 1A. So this is the co-reference condition. The artist sees a strong man sitting on the ground, and then she sees that the same man is holding a spear. I'm just going to play you the video so you can see how this was danced. And here's the disjoint reference condition. So the artist sees a strong man sitting on the ground, and then she sees another man holding a spear. So let's see what that looks like. And just looking at the results of the dance study, we can provide an initial answer to the question of why one should study dance semantics. Now, one may think that dance predominantly lacks any kind of descriptive meaning, but it can be shown that different dance movements can give rise to meaning inferences, which can be quite direct or more indirect and abstract. So as an example of a direct meaning, Bharatanatyam as a narrative dance is quite similar to pantomime. So here on the left, we see a dance posture from a narrative man, where a man is sitting. And on the right, we see a dance movement from a narrative where a woman is pointing at the clouds. And in both cases, the meaning is expressed in a highly iconic way, in the sense that the dancer essentially acts out the meaning. So I'm going to turn to more indirect and abstract meaning inferences that can arise from dance. And these are not restricted to narrative dances such as in Bharatanatyam. So what we see here is essentially something that amounts to an iconic discontinuity inference. So when the dancer was asked to dance a sequence involving two individuals, so this is the disjoint reference condition, she introduces a new position on the stage, and then she assumes that position in order to mark a different person. And this change in position and orientation clearly mark discontinuity. And we also carried out a pilot perception study afterwards, where we found that onlookers are in fact able to identify whether a given dance sequence contained a single individual or two individuals. Now, if we compare the disjoint reference condition, so this is on the top, with the co-reference condition at the bottom, one thing that we observe is that this discontinuity that we see in the disjoint reference condition doesn't arise in the case of co-reference. So if you look at these images on the bottom, you know, the case where a man is sitting on the ground and then the same man is holding a spear, the movement from one position to the other is completely fluid. There's no interruption. And you can see the fluidity of the movement by these green track lines here on the images. Now, of course, one question that arises at this point is whether onlookers who are not trained in Bharatanatyam dance can in fact draw inferences from watching a dance sequence. So are they able to identify whether there are one or more characters in the sequence? So we carried out a pilot perception study using these motion capture animations in order to see if participants are able to interpret the meaning that's encoded in the movement. We had a total of 32 participants, so it was a very small pilot. Each one saw a total of 18 videos. They saw 6 co-reference videos, 6 disjoint reference videos, and 6 fillers. And when we ran the production study, the initial production study, we also recorded stimuli on reflexives and they say. So for this production study, we used the reflexives videos as the fillers. And after watching a video, each participant was asked, can you identify the number of people in the story? Do you think that the dance sequence describes a story that involves one person or two people? And they were then given a 5-point scale to use for rating the videos. And here are the findings. So while this is a simple pilot study, and it really doesn't aim to be more than that, the ratings appear to go in the right direction. So we converted the results to a numerical scale where 1 corresponds to clearly co-reference and 5 corresponds to clearly disjoint reference. And while the overall ratings averaged around 3, the average rating in the disjoint reference condition is about 0.35 points higher than the average rating in the co-reference condition. And this also comes out as statistically significant. So the take-home message from this pilot study is that naive observers are actually sensitive to meaningful components in dance sequences. What we cannot know from this pilot study is how the participants decided on their ratings. There was an option to comment, but the participants mostly provided comments on the fillers and not the items. We also ran this study on 5 professional Bharatanatyam dancers, and the results are pretty much equivalent to those of the untrained participants. And that raises a very interesting question of why doesn't experience help dancers perceive a higher level of meaning components in the dance sequence? And we have no answer to this question, but it's something that we're very interested in. One relevant question is whether Bharatanatyam incorporates something like a rudimentary sign language. So whenever there are 2 referents, we see the introduction of a new location, and then the dancer assumes this new location. And you can see this in these images on the slide here. So the man in the first frame is clearly in a different position from the woman in the last frame. And these observations suggest that, Bharatanatyam has language-like features which look very much like sign language. So for one, sign languages use so-called loci, and these are positions in signing space that are associated with a given referent. And it looks as if narrative dance also establishes such loci. And to be clear, the dancer doesn't just introduce different positions on the stage, but she actually physically assumes one position first and then the other position later on. And this is very much reminiscent of the phenomena of role shift or action role shift in sign language, where a signer shifts their body to assume the perspective of another referent. For now, it's an open question whether Bharatanatyam truly incorporates something like a rudimentary sign language. And as you can see on this slide, we could think of the different positions on stage as loci, and I've just abbreviated them here as lock 1 and lock 2. But alternatively, the mechanism that gives us disjoint reference could be much more basic, and it could essentially amount to an iconic discontinuity inference. And it could be that this inference arises due to a grouping boundary which emerges from a change of orientation and direction at the point which the dancer assumes the new position on the stage. So to start shedding a little bit more light on whether positions on the stage matter, we carried out 2 follow-up studies. So one of the first things we tested in this second study is whether positions on the stage can be picked up again later in the same way in which this happens with sign language loci. So in the items that you see here on this slide, we first introduced a child that's eating a mango, and then a child that's holding a spear. And we had a transitive sentence where the subject and the object anaphorically pick up these 2 referents. And we tried this with two conditions. So in one condition, the subject of the transitive clause corresponds to the first referent and the object corresponds to the second referent. And the second condition has the inverse relationship. And both conditions A and B, they share the first two sentences, and they differ in the third sentence, which I've marked by the boxes. So let's first look at the part that they share. So here are the results, again, for the part that both conditions share. So you should read the pictures from top to bottom. And what we find is that the dancer starts in a neutral position in the center. She then introduces a position for the first referent, which we label lock 1. And then finally, she introduces a position for the second referent, labeled lock 2. Now, this is the part where the two conditions differ. So in item 1A, the subject of the subsequent clause corresponds to the first referent and the object to the second referent. And what happens is the dancer first points at locus 1. So this is the top picture. She then moves into the locus 1 position and orients herself towards locus 2. And that's what the bottom picture shows you. And the pointing at locus 1 is strongly reminiscent of sign language, where anaphoric links are also established by pointing towards a locus. And here's the B condition. So in this case, the subject of the subsequent clause corresponds to the second referent and the object corresponds to the first referent. And we see, a parallel effect to the other condition. So this time, the dancer first points at locus 2. So that's what you see in the top picture. She then moves into the locus 2 position and orients herself towards locus 1. And that's what we see in the bottom picture. And here are the crucial points summarized. So a position that's introduced earlier in the narrative to mark a character can be picked up again later in the narrative, again to symbolize the same character. And we can conclude, at the very least, that the dancer is keeping track of the character's positions in the narrative. She's not just marking disjoint reference by virtue of introducing a group boundary. Now, one may, of course, pursue the idea that, well, maybe the dancer simply divides the stage into two halves. So one half of the stage is dedicated to the first character, and the other half of the stage is dedicated towards the second character. And this may break down if more than two characters are introduced. So to test this, we carried out a third follow-up study. And here we introduced three characters: a man, a woman, and a child. And we recorded 6 variants of this scenario with these 3 references, and the possible orders are captured in 1A to 1F. So let's look at the results. Well, what happens is exactly what we expect. The dancer establishes 3 different positions on the stage. Now, once again, we can think about these 3 positions in terms of loci. So in the top position, we see the woman in locus 1, which is central. In the middle picture, we see the man in locus 2 to the right. And in the bottom picture, we see the child in locus 3 to the left. Now, one might wonder whether locus 1 and 3 are the same. They're not. And we're going to come back to this in a minute. So on this slide, we've kept the top 2 pictures the same, just so that we can see how locus 1 and 2 were positioned. And the bottom picture is new. And this shows what happens later on in the narrative after introducing locus 3 at the left, when the locus 2 referent is the subject of the verb and the locus one referent is the object. And this is the take home. So the dancer introduces 3 positions, one for a woman, one for a man, and one for a child. When she later aims to convey that the man is looking at the woman, she positions herself in the locus of the man and faces the locus of the woman. So to see how a narrative dance form like Bharatanatyam might be reminiscent of sign language, this experiment shows that directionality really matters when it comes to managing the characters in the narrative. And this appears to be quite similar to so-called agreement constructions in sign language. So here, the top picture is repeated from the last slide, and it shows a scene where the referent is in locus 2, and they look at the referent in locus 1. And by contrast, the bottom picture shows the mirror image where the referent is in locus 1 and they're looking at the referent in locus 2. And remember that locus 3 has been introduced prior to the critical sentences. So just to complete the picture, we can show that locus 1 and locus 3 are managed the same way, but they are sufficiently distinct. So the 2 pictures on the left are repeated from the last slide. What's new are the 2 pictures on the right. And the top picture shows the scene where the referent in locus 3, so this was the child, looks and points backwards at the referent in locus 1, the woman. And the bottom picture shows the mirrored scene where the referent in locus 1, so the woman, looks and points at the referent in locus 3, which is the child. Now, notice that locus 3 in the top right picture is further to the left than where it was originally introduced, which was approximately on the arrow of the red axis. And this is not surprising in any way, since loci in sign language are not exact points in space either. And it's quite plausible that the same observation is the case in dance. So one interesting parallel between Bharatanatyam specifically and sign language concerns the way in which the dancer expresses the meaning of another. Now, this is very speculative, but when the dancer describes 2 characters in the narrative that are sufficiently similar, so for example, 2 women, she uses this particular gesture. It's an arcing gesture from left to right, and it's carried out with a single hand. So I'm going to play you this clip. I'll play it a couple times because it's a bit quick. And again. Now, Bharatanatyam is an old dance form. It's 2,000 years old, and it involves conventionalized gestures. So we cannot overinterpret this. But the interesting observation is that the American Sign Language sign for other also involves an arcing movement from left to right. So here's a clip so we can see what this looks like. And again. Oh, here we go. Now, relatedly, Marie Coppola and Anne Senghas, in a forthcoming paper on deixis in Nicaraguan Sign Language, discussed that the NSL sign for another originated in a sign that also includes an arced outward movement. And they relate this to a gesture that means over there or another one. And it's reduced in its nominal use to a rotation of the wrist and the forearm. So this really opens up interesting routes of inquiry, such as whether this left to right arc, iconically reflects the core meaning of other. And this is something that we leave open for now, but we hope to revisit this at some point. So we've seen that Bharatanatyam shares features with natural language, But as a narrative dance, it also shares features with silent visual narratives. So we can now start to take steps towards a formal semantic analysis of what we've seen here. So Dorita Bush, building on work by Gabe Greenberg, raises the question of how to define truth in a visual narrative. And in order to answer this question, Abush discusses sentences like one, there are at least two cubes. Now, assuming that the world is populated by finitely many solid cubes and nothing else, if I utter, there are at least two cubes, I can rule out quite a few possible scenarios. So I would rule out cases, for example, where there are no cubes or where there's only one cube. Now, if we compare the picture in two to the sentence in one, what we notice is that pictures also provide information about the world. So it rules out some possibilities and it allows for others. So for example, the picture would rule out possibilities where there are no cubes, ones where there are only one. And Abush also points out that pictures are often more informative than sentences. So the example in two would rule out possibilities where the two cubes are not aligned, possibilities where the two cubes are white, or where there's no distance between them. And sentences can be more vague in this respect. So Abush proceeds to posit a generalized possible world model for informational entities. And the idea here is that a sentence or a picture counts as an informational entity when it rules out some possibilities. And the semantics of a picture can be identified with the set of possibilities that it admits. So we can define the semantics of a picture in terms of possible worlds or situations or scenes, and we can then posit satisfaction conditions of the kind that you see in 4. So if we model the semantics of narrative dance after the semantics of pictures, then we can posit satisfaction conditions of the kind that you see here in 5 and 6. Now, in line with what we discussed about the cubes, there are different ways in stating the satisfaction condition for a single dance position. So we could simply describe the eventuality without the participants. So this would be the condition in 5, or we could include the agent, and this would be the condition in 6. Now, of course, this analysis is connected to narrative or figurative dance, which encodes a visual narrative. If we were to look at non-figurative dance, we would need a more abstract semantics in line with what has been posited for music by Philippe Schlenker, which he takes to involve abstract sources. So dance and music go hand in hand, and most dances are often dance to music. And very natural questions arise at this point. What does the dance-music relationship look like? If dance has meaning, does music have meaning? If music has meaning, what does the meaning look like? So Schlenker, in a 2017 paper, posits an abstract semantics for music based on the idea that we draw meaning inferences from certain properties of the music. So things like pitch or the speed of this music. So just to show you how this works, I'm going to play 2 sound files. And one of them is at a lower pitch, and the other one is 3 octaves higher. Now, when you're listening to these sound files, try to imagine that they describe some fictitious object. So this could be an animal or a person or a landscape. And the question is, what the music tells us about the properties of such an object. So let's start by listening to the normal pitch one first. And here's the same piece, but 3 octaves higher. A general impression shared by most people is that the lower pitch music describes a large object, whereas the high pitch music describes a small object. And this is a very abstract type of meaning, but nevertheless, it's a meaning that we can infer from the music. At the same time, a lower pitch may convey that the music is describing something that's less excited or less energetic. And just to name one other sort of inference, a low speed would typically be identified with a slow source, such as a tortoise. And the original sound file is the one at the lower pitch. And it's quite telling, really, that the title of the piece is called The Elephant from Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals. And the higher pitch version of the sound file wouldn't be associated with an elephant, unless it's a really tiny elephant, I guess. In terms of Schlenker's approach to such inferences, the idea is that the listener interprets features of the music as being connected to some virtual source of the music. So something that causes the properties of the music. So for instance, in this example from Saint-Saëns, the virtual source would be an object, namely an imagined elephant. And crucially, these inferences themselves that we draw from the music are highly abstract. So if I didn't tell you to imagine an elephant, you might think that the virtual source is a large man. It could even be a landscape, such as a big forest with tall trees. So the meaning of music is at this level of abstraction. So the next step in developing a formal semantics of dance is to look at non-figurative, non-narrative dance and see how that ties in with music. And this is what I would like to do next. All right, what does this relationship between dance and music look like? Well, it's well established in the choreomusicology literature that different aspects of music have structural equivalents in dance. So if we look at this table from Mason, the idea here is that pitch in music corresponds to position and direction of gesture in space. So for instance, in their research, my music technology collaborators, Tejaswini and Alexander, critically evaluate an assumption that often occurs in the literature, which is that pitch contour corresponds to vertical up-down movement. And it turns out that such an up-down movement was less prominent in their own study. And I'll come back to this study in a moment. But for now, let's think about this idea from the previous slide on music semantics, that a low-pitched melody allows us to infer some large animal, such as an elephant. And this really begs the question of what would be a body movement that corresponds to such a low pitch, symbolizing a large animal. Well, one possibility might be to make bigger movements for low pitch and smaller movements for high pitch. And this would be very much in line with the musical inferences that we draw. So Tejaswini and Alexander carried out studies where they asked participants to listen to very short melodic excerpts. So these were around 4.5 seconds long. And participants were asked to move their body as if the movement was creating the sound. And what's interesting about this is participants were not instructed to express any meaning at all. And what they found is that study participants exhibited 6 dominant strategies in tracing the sound with their hands. So some of these strategies, like the middle one in the bottom, involved quite extensive movements. Others, like the one in the bottom left corner, involve the apparent manipulation of some small virtual object. Now, since these movements were not generated with the intention to convey meaning, we can ask whether they still capture meaningful components of the music. So the question that naturally arises at this point is the following. If the music contains some trigger of an inference containing the virtual source, does the movement inherit that trigger and give rise to the same inference? So I want to discuss an ongoing study which attempts to answer this question, but before that, I'd like to discuss an interesting observation concerning vibrato. And we're not focusing on our study in vibrato as such, but there's a very interesting observation to be made here about the relationship between music and movement to begin with. So in his work, Schlenker discusses that musical vibrato is typically associated with heightened emotions. And at the same time, Kelkar and Jensenius also observe that vibrato in music seems to give rise to large changes of acceleration in their motion capture data. So the movement of the hands in these sound tracings does seem to inherit the vibrato quality from the music. So the core hypothesis is then that movement that's based on a given piece of music may reproduce meaningful properties of the music, and it may do so without an actual conscious intention to be meaningful. In our ongoing study, which I'm going to discuss next, we ask this question of whether the meaning inference from the music can be carried over to body movement. So this is just an overview of this ongoing study, and we're testing to what extent which music and movement can convey emotion or express certain emotion terms, such as angry or excited or sad. And essentially, study participants will hear the original musical stimuli from Alexander and Tejaswini's study, and then they rate the extent to which each stimulus conveys a given emotion term. So participants will see a stick figure rendering of one person's movement, and these are taken from the original sound tracing study. And they'll rate the extent to which each stick figure video conveys a given emotion term. And then for musical stimuli and the corresponding sound tracings, we can then correlate whether study participants in the perception study rate the emotions similarly or differently. So, the goal of this study is to separately probe for meaning inferences from the musical stimuli and from the sound tracings. And then we'll statistically test for a correlation between the two. And we hope that this study will shed a little bit of light on if a movement is based on a musical sequence, so in this case, in the shape of sound tracings, do meaning inferences from the musical sequence carry over to the movement sequence? And you can test your own intuitions. So I can play you one of the stimuli from the sound, and then I can play you a silent video. And in the silent video, this depicts a non-trained study participant who spontaneously moves their hand to this particular sound file. So I'll play the sound file first. And here is the sound tracings video. So for now, there's many different ways one could set this study up. You know, for now we're using emotion terms and we're simply basing them on the 4-quadrant valence arousal model. And so we'll be testing whether the musical sequence or videos can convey something like the emotion term angry or calm and things like that. Now, of course, we could have asked participants to rate whether the music sequence and the dance sequence can express words like elephant or tortoise or kangaroo. But we've decided to go with the emotion terms as there's already a precedent in the form of Bo Siever's work. And we can ask what potential findings would mean in terms of an analysis. So musical inferences are typically understood to reflect a virtual source such as an elephant. Now, let's assume that amplitude of movement corresponds to loudness in music. Now, this is something that would have to be tested, but it might be the case that more movement is analogous to increased loudness, whereas less movement is analogous to decreased loudness. And in music, lower loudness corresponds to either a less energetic source or a source that's further away. So we can see that less movement, a smaller amplitude of movement, could also symbolize a less energetic source, whereas more movement could symbolize a more energetic source. But what exactly this means for the analysis and whether body movement could then be perceived to be movement of a virtual source really remains to be seen. So just to briefly summarize, in our study of Bharatanatyam, we found that disjoint reference can be encoded systematically. So there is evidence for conveying meaning in dance. And in the case of narrative dance, this meaning can also be quite concrete, partially building on iconicity as a way of encoding meaning. And what we found is that it appears as though we have features of language interacting with a language-like system. So the encoding of disjoint reference may involve rudimentary loci, which are introduced to the dancer to manage different reference in the story. At the same time, it could be that grouping itself may be meaningful in dance. And this is something that has received very little attention so far. It remains an open question whether a formal semantics of narrative dance requires both grouping and loci as devices for managing reference in a story. Perhaps loci alone could be sufficient. The abstract meaning that arises in music via musical inferences may also arise in dance in terms of how big or small a given movement is. And there may be at least 4 levels at which dance can encode meaning, all of which employ iconicity. So a dancer can move in a way that directly resembles something. So she can assume a sitting posture in order to symbolize a sitting event. A dancer can invoke more abstract inferences, such as a discontinuity inference, by dancing in discontinuous ways, so changing direction or orientation. And this could lead to a meaningful group boundary. A dancer could invoke abstract meanings of the type that we find in music, so by performing large movements to symbolize an energetic source or small movements to symbolize a less energetic source. And then finally, a dancer can use indexicality by creating designated positions or loci on the stage, which are then identified with a character in a narrative. So there's clear evidence for dance semantics and many, many avenues open for investigation, some of which we are currently exploring. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pritty, for this fantastic and enlightening lecture. I very much enjoyed it, and I'm sure that all the audience also enjoyed it. Before bringing in the questions from the audience, I would like to ask you two questions so you can expand the idea of what the goals and relevance of superlinguistics and make more, so we can approach it a little bit more before jumping in on more specific questions, if you agree.
Absolutely.
So my first question is, so why should linguists attempt to go beyond linguistics? So why should linguists attempt to go beyond traditional objects such as words and sentences?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So in terms of results, also from an interdisciplinary perspective, the hope is that the semantic methodology will further our understanding of meaning in nature. So, how do we interpret pictures or music? What kind of pragmatic mechanisms can be observed in monkey alarm calls? And linguistic methodology allows us to state very precise hypotheses, and these may inform research in other fields. And primatology is really a representative example here, where the data are now so rich that linguistic input can inform theorizing on primate communication systems in areas such as alarm calls and primate gestures. Now, turning to human language, we now understand better the actual role of things like speech accompanying gestures and facial expressions. And these seem to be such an integral part of face-to-face communication that, digital communication on social media has recruited things like emoji, which largely make the same kind of meaning contributions. And there are some surprising implications for core linguistic domains. So for instance, most linguists would agree that intonational contours are part of language proper. At the same time, facial expressions and in the synchronous written modality, certain emoji can be used to convey the same meanings. So to put it in a somewhat provocative way, if we study emoji, we may also learn a lot about natural language by proxy of emotion. Now, one final point I want to make is superlinguistics is not a surprising area of research in the sense that it's just a natural extension of syntactic structures, where Chomsky explores the interplay between theory and particular grammars that follow from it. There's no reason why these grammars should be restricted to context-sensitive grammars. It's perfectly legitimate within the syntactic structures framework to look at music semantics, dance semantics, and so on.
Fantastic. I completely agree. The second question is more related to your talk. So why should we reduce dance and music to truth conditions? And a related question is, are truth conditions really necessary for understanding dance? And what about aesthetic?
This is a great question. So to answer this question, let's just zoom out and think about what we mean when we say truth conditions. So the general idea of supersemantics is that we can describe meaning inferences that we draw from music or from dance or pictures. And for instance, in music, low pitch can trigger a meaning inference towards a large object. Now, the next step from inference to truth is a very, very small step. So we basically say that a music excerpt is adequate or true in situations that make all of its inferences true. So if a music excerpt triggers the inference that there's a large object, then the music excerpt is true in a situation in which there is a large object. And that's really all there is to this notion of truth conditions as we're using it. Now, in a scientific superlinguistic approach, we propose that dance and music and pictures and so on, it give rise to meaningful inferences. And whenever we encounter meaningful inferences, we can automatically speak about truth. And talking about inferences and talking about truth, these are two ways of essentially speaking about the same thing. So as soon as you can enjoy a piece of music or a dance sequence or a picture, and you can draw inferences on some virtual object or narrative, you automatically get a notion of truth. So for the dance examples, the introduction and assumption of a new position on the stage triggers this inference that there are two different objects, or two individuals or two characters. And as a consequence, the dance sequence is true in a situation in which this inference is met. So it's true in a situation in which there are two different characters, and it's false otherwise. Now, of course, there may be other aspects of, an art form, such as dance and music, which are not about inferences. And we're not claiming that those things don't exist. It's just that they're not the first things that we want to look at if we're interested in meaning in nature.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Pritty.
So we have some questions in the chat. One is from Selene Rodriguez, who is asking, so she has a comment, she points out that sign language can vary with respect to projection and manifestation of a determiner. Monolingual speakers of Libras, Brazilian Sign Language, do not have determiners. Bilinguals, on the other hand, use index pronouns to mark definite DPs and the numeral 1 to mark indefiniteness. Interestingly, monolinguals obligatorily use role shift to mark a reference between two DPs. Thus, maybe when D is not projected, role shift is the strategy to mark a reference. And then she concludes making the following question. Does these types of language have functional categories?
So non-standard objects?
I believe so. Yes.
I think the question is, how could we test for that?
Yeah.
So the short answer is I don't know. And it essentially comes down to a question of methodology, I think. So the linguistic methodology that I adopted, and the linguistic methodology that's been adopted in music, is one of minimal pairs. But in terms of experimental methodology, we used motion capture in dance. I'm not sure, and it was a very simple rating study, the perception study, where we were asking people to do that. I'm not sure how we could, what methodology we could employ to test for that. I think that's the question.
Let's see. Mark, sorry.
Sorry, can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
So just to be a bit more precise, so in the dance study, in the production study, we constructed narratives where, they only differed in one single component. And it was either co-referent or disjoint referent. And in the work on music, minimal pairs were also used, where, Schlanger, together with a composer, constructed pairs of melodies. And I guess the question is, if we were looking at functional projections or functional categories, what methodology could we employ to test for that? That's not clear to me.
I see. So connecting to Rodriguez's question, Mark van Ostendorp asks, if you would perform your perception experiment on the dance with the native signers, would you expect a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that we're currently looking at and looking into. I don't know, but it's something that we're actively pursuing. So to be continued.
And a third question by Marcus William Somerville. Would you consider music inferences arising in dance to be a study of metakinesics, for example, demonstrative of the dancer's cognition, or self-reflective of the octaves and pace of the music? And a follow-up, or would you consider it to be a study of kinesics?
Yeah. So the physicality, so as I mentioned in the beginning, when we're investigating a dance form, we're stripping away things like culture and we're focusing on just the physicality of the movement. And I guess if we want to look at the relationship, the kind of interplay between dance and music, there are cases in the choreomusicology literature where we find that, you know, the most dominant in terms of meaning inferences come from the music. And in other cases, the most dominant inferences come from the dance. And we find everything in between. So I guess the question would be, you know, is there variation in acceptability when we're looking at whether it's music dominant or whether it's physicality dance dominant?
And a final question by Adrian Gustavo. As a dancer, I try to relate the moves to the feeling I read, both the rhythm and the lyrics, but sometimes I try to reference artists on my dances. Which semantic relations happens on this case?
Yeah, so I want to point out that when we carried out the production study, the stimuli were not choreographed. So the dancer did not see the stimuli in advance. So, you know, she arrived at the motion capture studio, we presented her, you know, with the sample items, and she read them and then she danced them. And, you know, so there was nothing spontaneous about this. And of course, this is a narrative dance. So the next step in this agenda would be to look at non-narrative spontaneous dancing, or to look at more choreographed dance, and to see, you know, whether we find the same language-like properties that we do in narrative dance. And I suspect that the less narrative a dance form, the more abstract meaning inferences we would find. That is, the less language-like it would be. And of course, you know, if one is choreographing a dance, then there is you know, a certain intention there to convey specific aspects of the movement. And this needs, you know, much, much more attention.
Okay, so thank you so much on behalf of Aberlin, on behalf of all my fellow linguists in Brazil, for this amazing talk and for giving us the opportunity to expand our horizons on linguistic theorizing, on the type of data that we can explore, not only linguistic data, but, you know, we can go much beyond that. So thank you so much.
Very, very much. This was such a pleasure. I also wanted to briefly mention that I will respond to more questions offline. So if you have questions, please feel free to leave them in the YouTube chat, and I will I'll comment on them and I'll respond as a comment.
Okay, thank you so much, Pritty, and I hope to see you soon, sometime, somewhere.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.